Welcome to the PRIO Annual Peace Address. It's with great pride and pleasure that I welcome you all today. This is the first annual PRIO Peace Address in history. My name is Christian Berg Hartviken. I am the director of PRIO and I will be guiding you through this afternoon. Last year, PRIO celebrated its 50th anniversary. This was a wonderful occasion to reflect on our past, to discuss what peace research is today, and where it is that we want to take it in the years ahead. Peace research has become a field of study where academic excellence is crucial. Yet, our merits as peace researchers should not be confined only to academic circles. Our ultimate goal is to generate knowledge which will make a difference. To achieve this goal, we need to draw new ideas, inspiration from scholars, policymakers, practitioners, artists, and others who are engaged in peace and conflict matters. It's our ambition that the PRIO Annual Peace Address will be a platform for reflection, for inspiration that will be helping us achieve this goal. And of course, it's also our goal that this will be a platform where we can celebrate and honor friends who support and challenge us in difficult ways. This is why the seminar is followed this afternoon by a reception, and of course I hope to see you all there. We are working on serious issues. We are working on matters of war and peace. When we started working on PRIO's new strategy last year, I was quoted as saying that the ultimate aim was for the resulting strategy to be sharp and serious. The Peace Address is a natural born child of that strategy process. It shall be exactly that, sharp and serious. To this event, we will every year invite a distinguished guest to reflect on a topic of critical importance to peace research. Invitees may be scholars, artists, policymakers, or others. We want this to be an annual event in which we force ourselves to confront difficult questions, to debate them, in order to inspire the future agenda of peace research. Today's lecture, Justice, Truth, Peace, where Jon Elster will critically be examining the concept and practice of transitional justice, is the best possible start for a new lecture series. I'm glad that Jon accepted this honor. I'm also very glad that Libby Wood and Dagfinn Føllesdal both wanted to give some opposition in their role as commentators. And of course, very, very pleased to see so many PRIO supporters, friends, associates, alumni, and staff here today. Before we get to the meat, we will have some entertainment. We will have a piece of music. The band that we have is the Staffan William Olsen Trio. They're now coming in from behind. We have Staffan William Olsen on the guitar. We have Andreas Amundsen on the bass. And we have Herman Nygaard on the drums. They are handpicked in the hope that they will match the taste of today's guest of honor, Jon Elster, whose musical preferences we have mapped through sophisticated techniques. Here, the band will play one tune only. They will come back and entertain us more later. But here only one tune, which is Peace by Horace Silver. Please. Jon Elster does not need much in terms of the introduction, but nonetheless, let me say a few words. He is a Robert K. Merton Professor of Social Sciences. He has an appointment in political science and philosophy at the Colombia University. He is also a professeur titulaire at the Collège de France in Paris. And here at PRIO, over the last 7 years, he has been leading the working group on the micro-foundations of civil war at our Center for the Study of Civil War. And not the least, of course, he's the author of numerous works, more than most of us can count, in the philosophy of social science, in the social sciences, rational choice theory, and I could go on and on. Amongst his more known titles, many of them are actually well known, but make a small selection here. We have Ulysses and the Sirens, we have Nuts and Bolts for the social sciences, we have Alchemies of the Mind, and you can already hear that this is a man who has a good sense of titles. And of course, relevant today, we have his 2004 book, Closing the Books, Transitional Justice in Historical Perspective. And it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Let me start out by noting that the human mind has a natural tendency to assume that all things go together. This may be a result partly of what psychologists call trade-off ambiguity, trade-off aversion, and partly wishful thinking. And here are some examples. Marx asserted that in transition to communism, one should try to, as he wrote, shorten and lessen the birth pangs. For a given duration of the transition, less violence would obviously be desirable. For a given level of violence during the transition, the shorter it is, the better. But a more gradual transition might involve less violence. The movement for socially responsible investment is based on a premise of doing well by doing good. In some cases, the profit motive and community benefits may indeed be maximized simultaneously, as when consumers refuse to buy goods produced with the use of child labor. Is the mic okay? Typically, however, mutual funds that refuse to buy alcohol and tobacco stocks do less well than others because they cut themselves off from a valuable source of diversification. Public policy is usually guided by concerns of distributive justice as well as efficiency. In practice, however, we know that justice or equity and efficiency may be at odds with each other because of the problem called the leaky bucket. When transferring wealth from a rich person to a poorer one, some wealth is usually destroyed or not created. The French Revolution was based on the mostly tacit assumption that the values of equality, liberty, and fraternity supported and reinforced each other, so that more of one led to more of the others, not less. Although each of these three values is endlessly ambiguous, on many common understandings they are more likely to work against one another than to favor one another. Radical thinkers claim that liberty is inconsistent with equality. Libertarian thinkers argue that fraternity is inconsistent with liberty, and Rawls claim that strict equality was inconsistent with fraternity because it might make the worse off than they would be under a regime of moderate inequality. So in this talk, I'll examine another trio of values in this perspective: justice, truth, and peace. I shall do so not in the abstract, but in the context of political transitions. These include transition from authoritarian rule to democracy, from the defeat of the two Athenian oligarchies in 411 and 403 BC, up to the recent transition in Iraq. I shall also mention transition to constitutional monarchy that took place in England in 1660 and in France in 1814 and in 1815. In the context of the Civil War, we may talk about transitions to peace. Examples include the negotiated end to the wars of religion established by the Edict of Nantes in 1598, the negotiated Bosnian transition in 1995, and in 2009 defeat of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. The two Athenian cases also fall in this category. In developing my argument, I shall cite many of these cases as well as several others. And I'm going to pay particular attention to the ongoing processes of demilitarization and land restitution in Colombia. Although some prefer the term armed conflict rather than civil war to characterize the political violence in that country, that does not matter for my purposes. A key element in that effort to reduce violence is a law of justice and peace, which was adopted in July 2005 after extensive negotiations between the paramilitary, United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, and the government. It provides a framework for the demobilization and reinsertion of members of illegal armed groups. Although it applies to guerrillas as well as to paramilitaries, so far only the latter have availed themselves of this option. Members of illegal armed groups would then sent to demobilize under the law of peace, justice and peace, are those who hope to avoid ordinary criminal prosecution before the International Criminal Court, and crucially extradition to the United States, in exchange for receiving shorter prison sentences than any of these options would involve. They must render full confessions, hand over illegally acquired assets, notably land, cooperate in the dismantling of the armed group, and cease all legal activities. Victims of crime committed by the beneficiaries of this law can claim reparations funded by the assets that are confiscated and handed over. And since this is a PRIO event, it is appropriate to mention that PRIO Center for the Study of Civil War, that Christian Harbiken referred to, has a long-standing collaboration with organizations and individuals in Colombia. Since 2004, Martin Bergsmo, Scott Gates, and I have organized half a dozen conferences in Bogota on civil war, transitional justice, and most recently, land reform. And later I'll return to a perceptive remark made by Jim Pirro at one of these events. So I'm now going to say first a few words about each of the three values in the title, and then discuss tensions and synergies that can arise among them. So, I distinguish between alleviatory justice and transitional justice, The first expression is a term of art, and not particularly well chosen. I welcome proposals to improve it. It refers to measures taken to address and alleviate the injustices that cause the conflict, in distinction from transitional justice, which is concerned with injustices caused by the conflict. Many civil wars begin because part of the population has a grievance against the government based on a perceived injustice. Often, the grievance is that of an economically oppressed majority, where the injustice can take the form of unequal distribution of land or of huge income disparities. Elevatory justice then requires economic redistribution, and Colombia exemplifies this case. In other cases, the grievance is that of a politically oppressed minority, where injustice can take the form of the minority being denied access to the vote or to public office, the right to worship its own religion, or the right to use its own language. The French wars of religion in the 16th century and the recent conflict in Sri Lanka exemplified this case, which requires, in which case elevatory justice requires political reform. Generally speaking, and I'm talking extremely generally here, I'm afraid, the aim of elevatory justice could be intrinsic, instrumental, or both. When the Athenian Democrats reformed the political system after defeats of the oligarchy in 403 BC, it was both because they realized the intrinsic value of the rule of law, as distinct from unconstrained popular sovereignty, and because they wanted to eliminate the root cause of the oligarchic coups and prevent recurrence. When Henry IV, after converting to Catholicism, granted the Calvinist minority the right to worship in their fortified cities, it was partly an instrumental measure designed to end the devastating wars, and partly a measure designed to satisfy his former co-religionists. Economic redistribution may be sought for its own sake, as a measure of justice, and granted as a means to social peace and conflict prevention. The main components of transitional justice are punishment of wrongdoers and reparation for victims, either in the form of compensation or of restitution of property. In addition, one often observes the purges in the civil and military administration. Punishment of wrongdoers and reparations for victims are easily justified on intrinsic grounds. The former can be said to deserve punishment, the latter to deserve reparation. Instrumental arguments are more difficult to assess. According to one argument that is widely used in the human rights community, severe punishment of wrongdoers is needed as a signal to the future that will dissuade potential dictators or insurgents from trying to grab power. As I shall explain, I do not find that argument persuasive. Similarly, in Czechoslovakia after 1989, many argued that unconditional respect for the pre-communist property holdings was required to send a signal to foreign investors. In light of the important, if elusive, factor of confidence in financial matters, that argument may have had a better justification. According to a further instrumental argument, retribution and reparation are needed to stabilize the post-transitional society, and I'll return to that claim as well. In processes of transitional justice, retribution and reparation can serve as substitutes for each other. If large-scale compensation will be too costly, in economic terms, severe punishment for wrongdoers can serve as a partial substitute. I mention this as a conjecture for which I have no strong evidence. But it seems plausible, I think, that lack of compensation to victims might at least fuel their demand for punishment. Conversely, if retribution will be too costly in political terms, restitution can serve as a substitute. For this effect, there is some evidence. When the West German government under Adenauer enacted generous reparations after World War II, it was partly to deflect attention from the very modest prosecution and purges of former Nazi officials. It has also been argued that the Chilean reparations after 1990 served as a substitute for retribution, and some who were entitled to reparations refused them as blood money. The relations between reparative justice and distributive justice are complex. On the one hand, they compete for the same resources, which in times of transition especially can be very scarce. On the other hand, they are based on different principles. Reparation is backward-looking and entitlement-based. To the extent that distributive justice is alleviatory, meaning oriented towards conflict prevention in the future, it is forward-looking. In the aftermath of conflict, however, there would also be a mass of suffering that justifies redistribution on present-oriented grounds of acute needs. Among the 3 million displaced persons in Colombia, out of a population of 45 million, a large fraction do not fall under a provision in the law on justice and peace that would entitle them to receiving land. In many transitions, alleviatory justice has not been a major consideration. Although the initial impulse of the Allies in 1945 was to prevent Germany from ever again being able to wage war, that concern did not survive at the beginning of the Cold War. In countries occupied by Germany, the fear of a resurgence of Nazi movements in the future was nil, as was the fear of a rebirth of communism after the 1989 East European transitions. In this last, the main concerns were retribution, reparation, and some measure of redistribution. And this could be combined in various ways. In Romania, upper limit on the size of restitutive plots to liberate some land for the formerly landless. In Czechoslovakia, the decision to restitute land in kind rather than to compensate the former owners financially was motivated, among other reasons, by the desire to prevent the property from ending up in the hands of the former communist leaders. A very general tension between backward-looking entitlements and present need arises in cases of dual ownership. Sometimes property is confiscated by the state in a pre-transition regime and then distributed or sold to new owners. This happened in Athens in 404 BC, in England in 1648, and in France in 1793. It was also the case for Jewish property in France and other countries during World War II, and for communist Europe after 1945. In some cases, original owners have been forcibly dispossessed of their property, or possession by war or civil war, and others have simply stepped in to take their place. And this includes a very important and common case of forcible sale of property at artificially low prices. After the transition, the 4 possible solutions have all been observed. First, the property may be returned to the original owners without compensation to the new ones, as happened with Jewish property in France after 1945. Second, it may be returned with compensation, as sometimes happened in England after 1660. It may be retained by new owners with compensation to the original ones, as was the solution chosen by France in 1815. And finally, it can be retained without compensation, as was the case after 1989 for German properties that had been confiscated by the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1949. The choices among these solutions seem to depend on, first, the time between the dispossession of the original owners and the regime transition, and second, on the good or bad faith in which the property was subsequently acquired. I now want to turn to the search for truth in post-conflict situations. And this search can take a number of forms, institutional as well as personal. So first, the truth can take an institutional form in truth commissions set up to uncover and document political wrongdoings that took place before the transition. Since wrongdoings have perpetrators and victims, the Commission will often provide information about these as well, always about victims and sometimes about perpetrators. In Poland, Romania, Estonia, and Lithuania, security files have been used as an instrument of truth revelation by creating an incentive for individuals to tell the truth about their involvement with the pre-transitional regime. In this procedure known as lustration, individuals seeking elective or high appointive office are asked whether they ever collaborated with the security services under communism. If the answer is yes, voters or administrators are free to elect or appoint them, or not. If the answer is no, and are later found out to have lied, they are blocked from office for a certain number of years. Other procedures aim at acknowledging the truth, rather than strictly speaking discovering it. An example is judicial rehabilitation, which occurs when an unjust conviction or condemnation from the previous regime is formally cancelled under the new regime. To cite only one example among many, in Mongolia after 1992, the Supreme Court has rehabilitated 22,000 victims of Stalinist repression. The process provides a certificate of rehabilitation to the families of the victims with no compensation for economic loss, for wrongful death, or for other harms illegally inflicted by the Soviet state. The aim is presumably to provide satisfaction and a sense of closure to the families. Whereas rehabilitation is victim-based, official apologies offer a perpetrator-based acknowledgement of the truth about past wrongdoings. Melissa Nobles at MIT has documented 60 such apologies over the last half-century, more than half of them made by heads of state, and the vast majority relating to World War II or to the origins of national settlements. Very recently, the British Prime Minister offered his apologies for the 1974 events of Bloody Sunday in Ireland. With a few exceptions, these apologies do not go together with compensatory measures. When apologies are both given and asked for, the demand for apology is determined mainly by a sense of grievance and the supply often by electoral concerns. In some cases, apologies are given but not asked for, and also conversely. The search for truth may also be matter of personal choice. In several post-communist countries, individuals have the right to ask for access to their security files, notably to discover whether friends or family members had informed on them during the communist era. A friend from the former East Germany told me that she needed to consult the files to get her past back. She wanted to know whether she was denied promotion because she was thought incompetent or because she was considered politically unreliable, and whether her boyfriend stopped seeing her on his personal initiative or because somebody told him to. So I'll now turn to peace. In any post-conflict situation, the establishment of a durable peace is, of course, of overwhelming importance. Most obviously, this requires the cessation of open armed conflict. And in addition, the cessation of what one might call virtual conflict is highly desirable, since if everybody acts on the assumption that the war might resume tomorrow, that outcome is made more likely. Among measures that can prevent such self-fulfilling predictions, one can cite the demobilization of armed personnel, the handing in of guns, and the presence of an international peacekeeping force. Building a new and stable society also requires what you might call civic peace. I'll understand that situation as one characterized by a low level of ordinary criminal violence, some form of psychological healing, and a cooperative attitude of public officials to the post-transitional regime. Or to put it the other way around, factors undermining civic peace include higher rates of crimes against persons, strong emotions of hatred and resentment, and sabotage of the new regime by agents and collaborators of the former regime. The failure of the first French Restoration in 1814 was due in large part to the lenient purge of officials and officers who remained loyal to Napoleon, thereby providing a clear case in which insufficient transitional justice caused the collapse of the post-transitional regime. When Louis XVIII came back after 100 days, he did not repeat that mistake. So I'm now going to discuss a number of complex relations between justice and truth. So justice may serve as a goal of truth. May serve the goal of truth, excuse me. Justice may serve the goal of truth when truth is produced as a byproduct of ordinary workings of the justice systems. Trials of wrongdoers will make the wrongdoings known to the public, especially if they are tried on camera rather than in camera. The Nuremberg trials served this function, as did the trials of the Argentine military in the 1980s. In the latter country, when the trial to the members of the military juntas was initiated, everyday media were flooded by the horrors of state terrorism. Truth may also serve as a substitute for justice. Truth commissions in South Africa and elsewhere are typically created in conditions where the leaders of an autocratic regime retain enough power to block or severely limit the extent of penal proceedings after the transition. The creation of truth commissions can then serve as a compromise. In many countries, their main task has been to document wrongdoings and to identify victims. In a few cases, notably South Africa and El Salvador, the task of identifying wrongdoers has also been part of the mandate of the commissions. In South Africa, the exposure of wrongdoers did not lead to their prosecution if the commission found that their crimes were motivated by political aims rather than by malice or greed. The Truth Commission in El Salvador also named the wrongdoers, but Parliament gave them a full amnesty 5 days after the report was published. Yet even in the absence of a mandate to name perpetrators, truth-finding can reveal their identity. In Argentina, on a parallel track to the trials of a small number of military personnel, the government created a National Commission of Disappeared, which documented 9,000 persons who had been disappeared. The commission itself did not name perpetrators, but someone inside it leaked 1,351 names to the press. Although Brazil never had an official truth commission, the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo secretly prepared a report on torture in Brazil that received wide attention when it was published in July 1985. And 5 months later, the Archdiocese published the names of 444 torturers. In Chile, the Truth Commission documented 3,000 human rights violations and recommended extensive reparations. Although the report did not name perpetrators, the Communist Party paper El Siglo published the names of human rights violators. In such cases, public knowledge of the identity of the wrongdoers may at least partially serve the purposes of justice. The wrongdoers are not jailed, but exposed to public contempt, which, according to Adam Smith, is even worse. As he wrote, compared with the contempt of mankind, all other evils are easily supported. In addition to being target of contempt and ostracism, known wrongdoers may also suffer physically. In Argentina, one Navy captain, who was well known for his brutal acts, suffered dozens of attacks by strangers on the streets, by people who say he tortured them or their relatives. Shaming and revenge, even when based on accurate information, do not amount to justice, however. In a civilized society, justice should be left to the courts, not to observers of wrongdoings or to victims of wrongdoings. This statement is even more obviously true when names of wrongdoers are made public without proper verification of their guilt. In these cases, we are dealing with allegations, not with findings. In several post-communist countries, lists of large numbers of alleged informers or collaborators have been posted on the internet without any prior verification. 75,000 in the Czech Republic and 160,000 in Poland. The security archives on which these lists were based are notoriously both incomplete, as full-time members of the security services were usually not listed, and inaccurate, as some files were mere fabrications. In other words, the lists are likely to contain both false positives and false negatives. Although one can easily imagine the reaction of the individuals who were named, there has not, to my knowledge, been any systematic study of that subject. In a small-scale precedent from 1998, an unknown organization in Lublin, in Poland, published the names of 119 persons who had allegedly cooperated with the militia before 1989. And 2 of the named individuals killed themselves. It seems plausible that the longer lists have had similar effects. Arguably, this rough justice is worse than abstaining altogether from seeking justice. Unlike the Latin American cases, there is not even the excuse that ordinary legal prosecution was unavailable. Truth may also be an instrument for providing justice to victims. This idea comes in a modest and in a more ambitious version. In the modest version, fact-finding by truth commissions can lay the factual groundwork for reparations to victims. The South African and Chilean commissions, for instance, perform this task. In South Africa, it did not make much of a difference, but in Chile, this work was quite important. The South African Commission also made a more ambitious claim that truth can contribute to healing and what has come to be called restorative justice. It is not quite clear to me what this means. Mostly, restorative justice seems close to what I call civic peace. So I'll discuss it, therefore, when I consider the relation between truth and peace. For the same reason, I'll postpone until later the discussion of the effects of judicial rehabilitation and official apologies. So I now turn to the relation between justice and peace. Going back to 1994, when Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury in the Roosevelt administration, devised a plan for how to deal with Germany after the defeat. He wanted to set the clock back to 1910 and turn the country into a pastoral economy. The coal mines in the rural should be flooded or dynamited and sealed for 50 years to make the Germans impotent to wage future wars. The Germans should be prohibited from developing any kind of industry that could be converted into military production. As Morgenthau wrote, if you have a bicycle, you can have an airplane. If you have a baby carriage, you can have an airplane. Although Morgenthau initially persuaded both Roosevelt and Churchill to go along with his plan, they backed off when it became clear that it might have, in fact was having, negative effects on the conduct of the war and could delay the peace. Knowledge of the extreme severity of the expected punishment would stiffen the German will to resistance. For this reason, among others, the plan was not implemented in its draconian form. Justice and peace have been at odds in other cases too. In Bosnia, France and Britain saw the issue of war criminals as a potential impediment to making peace in ex-Yugoslavia, binding the hands of policymakers who might have to cut a deal with criminal leaders. Similarly, a perverse scenario inducing a dictator to fight for his survival may have happened recently when a prosecutor for Sierra Leone's International Criminal Tribunal indicted Charles Taylor in Nigeria. This action prevented diplomatic efforts from striking a deal with a former dictator who arguably could have facilitated a smoother transition. But we have to be careful in characterizing these conflicts in terms of justice versus peace. Morgenthau's desire for heavy punishment was based on the desire for vengeance rather than for justice. And in recent discussion, the issue has often been stated as one of short-term peace versus long-term peace. The demand for severe punishment of dictators and autocrats has been based on the argument that courts must set a clear precedent to dissuade would-be dictators in the future, even at the cost of prolonging the conflict in the present. But as Otto Kirchheimer noted some 50 years ago, the precedent might backfire if it induced the leaders of a future war to fight to the bitter end, rather than surrender and face the possible future of war criminals. It is possible, although in my opinion psychologically implausible, that some aspiring dictators might refrain from grabbing power because of the consequences of losing it. It is certainly plausible that the same fear may cause dictators to hang on to power longer than they would otherwise have done. I have yet to see a convincing argument why the first of these effects would dominate the second. Diane Orendlicher, a prominent scholar in the human rights community, asserts, with no argument, and one example, that the prospect of facing prosecutions is rarely if ever the decisive factor in determining whether a transition will occur. Well, if that were so, why would the prospect of facing prosecutions be a decisive, dissuasive factor? Even if an argument to that effect were forthcoming, the advocates of severe punishment would have a hard task. They would have to show not only that the expected smaller number of future conflicts offsets the expected longer duration, but also that the net effect in the future exceeds the cost of a delayed peace in the present. If one believes, as I do, that neither of these arguments can be successfully made, the idea of sacrificing peace for justice by punishing dictators severely now has no foundation. In fact, an argument can be made for treating all dictators leniently, if I'm right in my belief that this policy would reduce the duration of current and future conflicts while having little impact on the number of conflicts in the future. Yet a policy of leniency could run into either of two related problems: lack of legitimacy and lack of credibility. The population at large may require that those responsible for wrongdoing and atrocities be severely punished. If they are not, the government might fall and the peace process might come apart. But the wrongdoers might not be willing to step down if they face the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison. So the question then becomes if there exists a window of opportunity, as it were, a degree of punishment that is severe enough to punish the population and mild enough to be acceptable to the wrongdoers. In Colombia, this window seems to exist because of the threat of extradition to the United States, which, as subsequent events showed, is a highly credible one. At the same time, the Justice and Peace law opens for the possibility that drug lords could go free or receive reduced sentences and at any rate escape extradition to the US by virtue of the clause that granted amnesty for crimes with an indirect political purpose, the drug trafficking being a means to finance political ends. This clause was later struck down by the Constitutional Court. As I remarked earlier, the law was negotiated between the government and the paramilitaries. The fact that this crucial clause was struck down by the court points to an intrinsic problem in the negotiated transition in a negotiated settlement of conflict in a democracy. When a government negotiates with insurgents or paramilitaries, the latter know, or at least they should know, that the government is constrained by parliament and by the courts. It is in fact a defining characteristic of democracy, based on the separation of power, that the government cannot force the legislative and judicial branches to uphold its promises. This has been an acute problem in Latin American as well as in East European transitions. In Colombia, the threat of extradition was credible because the government had both the power and the motivation to carry it out if necessary. By contrast, the government could not make a credible promise of amnesty for political crimes. So far, I've discussed tensions between peace and transitional justice. We also need to address the relation between peace and distributive justice, a question especially important in the aftermath of civil wars that had economic injustice as the root cause. The following anecdote provides an illustration. In one of the conferences I co-organized in Bogota, Jim Pearson at Stanford made the following comment. If a topic had if a conference had been organized on this topic 40 years ago, the most frequently cited name would have been Karl Marx. At this conference, the most frequently cited name has been Thomas Hobbes. So in Colombia today, Hobbesian violence, rather than Marxian exploitation, is perceived as the main social ill. But to create a durable peace, it is not enough to reduce violence. To address the issue of violence by measures of transitional justice, one will also have to address issues of exploitation, inequality, and poverty by measures of distributive justice. Land reform is even more needed today than in the past because of the vast landed properties concentrated in the hands of drug lords and paramilitary leaders. At the same time, it is more difficult than ever because of the close links between land-owning members of parliament and the drug lords. Given the need for both transitional and distributive justice, governments face the problem of allocating scarce resources. They must decide whether to give priority to compensating victims of the conflict itself or to improving the situation of the landless poor in general. In abstract terms, should compensation be made on the basis of entitlement or need? The aim of a durable peace may favor the latter criteria, and that of transitional justice, the former. Whereas redistribution often encounters great resistance among entrenched elites, transitional justice may command greater agreement. As Maria Paula Safon, my graduate student at Colombia, who is from Colombia, has argued, transitional justice in the form of restituting land to those who can document ownership may be the maximum that is politically feasible. In the current demobilization process in Colombia, scarce resources are also devoted to subsidizing the ex-paramilitaries to prevent them from taking up their arms again. Although this may be a necessary measure to ensure a durable peace, victims of the conflict may see this subsidy to perpetrators as deeply unjust. So I'll now turn to relations between truth and peace. Truth commissions can preserve peace in the sense of absence of armed conflict by making it impossible to deny that massive wrongdoings took place prior to the transition. In South Africa, many members of the white elite might have refused, in more or less good faith, to believe claims about apartheid wrongdoings had these not been so fully documented in the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The work of the commissions in Argentina and Chile also made it impossible to sustain the myth that the dictatorships were justified by the task of weeding out criminal or subversive elements. If the truth in these countries had not been publicly recognized, the new regimes might have been jeopardized and the previous repressive regimes have restored. The work of the Truth Commissions underwrote the enormously effective message, never again. Truth can also have an important impact on civic peace. If agents and collaborators of old regime remain in high office after the transition, there's a risk that they may either work actively to undermine the new regime or be vulnerable to blackmail by members of the former security services who are aware of their past involvements. For both these reasons, it matters to find out the truth about their past. And as I said, the process of restoration is oriented towards this end. In fact, restoration serves justice as well as peace. Since individuals who are caught lying about their past are sanctioned not for what they did then, but for what they say now about what they did then, the problem of retroactivity that often mars processes of transitional justice does not arise. A variety of restoration is also used in the Colombian peace process. The Justice and Peace Law has created the possibility of gambling with the truth by offering the incentive of reduced sentences in exchange for full confession and reparation to victims. If a serious wrongdoer doesn't apply for the benefits provided by the law and then loses the gamble because he's found out, he faces ordinary criminal law sentences, which are 5 or 10 times higher than those imposed for similar crimes by the Justice and Peace Law. If he wins and his crimes are not discovered, he remains free. The efficacy of this procedure obviously depends on the government's knowledge about serious crimes, or more accurately, on the belief of the wrongdoers about the government's knowledge and on its capacity to enforce prosecutions. So I now return to the question whether truth commissions may contribute to healing and social peace. When truth-finding does not go together with retributive justice, this claim seems to me at least intrinsically implausible. Knowledge about wrongdoings may be painful if one also knows that the wrongdoers will go free. Even when the ideal is truth with justice, it follows from a general theory of the second best, that truth without justice is not necessarily desirable. From the victim's point of view, knowing who the offender is and knowing that he will go free is likely to generate resentment and bitterness rather than catharsis and healing. So given offender immunity, ignorance about offender identity might be better. And according to one recent comprehensive survey, we lack clear evidence that truth-telling produces psychological benefits for victims, or that healing at individual level correlates with group-level reconciliation and other society-level outcomes. And according to the same survey, there's no evidence of negative effects either. So although my inclination is to believe that truth-telling will do the victims more harm than good, the empirical jury is still out on that question. It is sometimes claimed that truth could also emerge and produce restorative justice through the direct encounter between victims and perpetrators. In a document produced by the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, we read that in South Africa, quote, the interaction between victims and perpetrators of human rights abuses helped to dispel the perception that the perpetrators were exempt from punishment. This exchange humanized some of those who committed human rights abuses giving the opportunity to appear as hostages of a system they could not control. End of quotation. Although there's no evidence to prove or disprove this claim, it strikes me once again as intrinsically implausible. In fact, the physical separation of victims and perpetrators might be more effective. The amnesty that the Athenians granted the oligarchs in 403 BC went together with a demand that the oligarchs leave the city. They were allowed to come back later when emotions had cooled down. According to the statement I just cited from the United Nations Council, emotions would cool down through interaction, not by its absence. The French wars of religion came to an end only when the Protestants were allowed to have their own fortified cities, after the failure of early attempts to let Protestants and Catholics coexist on a local basis. And referring to Bosnia, Monica Nalepa writes that the strategy developed by the war crime chamber staff is to begin prosecutions with those perpetrators who are most visible in public life. If administered consistently, this will gradually create an incentive mechanism for former perpetrators to shy away from public office. This outcome also satisfies victims who are not confronted by the glaring presence of their former perpetrators on a daily basis. And in the Colombian context, a relevant measure might be to ensure that demobilized paramilitaries and members of guerrilla forces do not resettle in areas where they inflicted harm on civilians. Moreover, truth itself, or the speaking of truth, might not be desirable. A striking feature of the edicts of the French wars of religion is the ban they imposed on making any references to past conflicts. As you know from other cases, such gag rules, taking certain topics off the table, can sometimes be quite effective. Now, let me also return to judicial rehabilitation and official apologies. In itself, it would seem rehabilitation can do no harm and may do some good. Nevertheless, there is an obvious risk that it may serve as a costless substitute for other measures that would have economic or political costs. As I noted earlier, in Chile after Pinochet and in Germany after 1945, governments awarded tangible reparations because of the high political cost of punishment of wrongdoers. In Mongolia, the government may have carried out symbolic rehabilitations because of the high economic costs of tangible reparations. Now, official apologies constitute a deeper problem. Over the last 50 years, governments all over the world have expressed regret, remorse, and apologies, as well as asking for forgiveness for what their predecessors did at various times in the past. Sometimes they used more impersonal language, as in deploring these past actions or acknowledging that these actions were wrong. Whatever their political and psychological efficacy may be, the moral status of these statements is, I submit, highly ambiguous, and often, in fact, they are nothing short of meaningless. For a country to deplore what this government did in the past doesn't seem to differ from deploring what other governments are doing today. And to apologize for what dead individuals did to other dead individuals is absurd on metaphysical grounds. Even when some of the victims are still alive, for others than the perpetrators to apologize is an equally empty gesture. It may be objected that if the victims or their descendants request and obtain some satisfaction from an apology, these metaphysical scruples are excessive. Even if meaningless, one might say, the apology does no harm and may do some good. I strongly disagree, however, with the claim that apologies are harmless. Apologies for what people are no longer alive, did to other people who are no longer alive, tacitly presuppose a form of essentialism with respect to nations or ethnic groups. When Germans today apologize for what their grandfathers did before 1945, or David Cameron apologizes for events that took place when he was 5 years old, they tacitly presuppose that the German or the English nation persists as a collective entity over time, and that this entity, as such, can be held morally accountable. And this view is not only a flagrant violation of ethical individualism, but in my view, downright pernicious. Anything that reinforces essentialism also reinforces a tendency to blame and punish individuals on the basis of their membership in a group. The history of anti-Semitism bears witness to this fact. Ethnic violence all over the world, just think about Serbia and Kosovo, is fueled by the assumption that the other is intrinsically evil and intrinsically inferior. Although apology making may have some short-term benefits, there's a real danger that the cumulative long-term effect of the practice will be to cause more acts for which more future apologies will be needed. I want to conclude, therefore, with a general warning against what you might call iatrogenic effects of implementing justice, truth, and peace in transitional processes. In medicine, the term is used for any adverse condition in a patient resulting from treatment. In this talk, I will discuss several iatrogenic effects. Apologies will reinforce essentialist beliefs that encourage actions for which more apologies may be needed. Credible threats of severe punishment to autocrats will cause them to hold on to power longer than ever others have done. The search for truth about wrongdoings without punishment of wrongdoers will cause resentment and hatred rather than healing and reconciliation. Forcing victims and perpetrators to interact will have the same negative effects. A focus on transitional justice will cause neglect of elevatory and distributive justice, and as a result undermine the stability of transition. And the search for rough justice will on balance create injustice if we believe with Blackstone that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent person suffer. Now, in making these claims, I asserted that these iatrogenic effects will arise, rather than that they may arise. But in truth, my evidence does not quite support this strong language. So my statement should be understood, part as a research agenda, part as a warning against a certain form of political correctness. In these matters of life and death, nothing is as irresponsible as to base policy proposals on poorly supported causal assertions. The only claim about which I feel fully confident concerns the danger of official apologies. They presuppose essentialism, which is both demonstrably false and demonstrably dangerous. Thank you.
Withhold my urge to ask questions. We have instead recruited two very competent commentators. The first one is Libby Wood, Elisabeth Jean Wood. She is a professor of political science at Yale University. She is also a professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and she is a friend of the host here at PRIO, which is why I take the liberty of calling you Libby. Amongst other things, she has published the book Insurgent Collective Action and Civil War in El Salvador, and particularly relevant in the current context, she has published the book Forging Democracy from Below, Insurgent Transitions in South Africa and El Salvador. Libby, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this challenging and indeed troubling lecture. Professor Elster warns not that there may be iatrogenic effects, but there will be such effects between justice, peace, and truth in the course of transitions from conflict and authoritarianism. I will begin by suggesting that Professor Elster's central metaphor is misleading if taken too literally, and illustrate the point with some of the trade-offs between peace for two cases that made joint transitions to both peace and democracy. I then advance some suggestions for pursuing the lecture's research agenda. Before closing with some reflections about Colombia, I raise some questions about some of his claims. In bringing his usual clarity of mind to the question of transitional justice, Elster shows that iatrogenic effects go well beyond those recognized in the literature, and that frequently cited efforts to mitigate such trade-offs are less effective than widely believed. The metaphor raises a series of questions. Who is the doctor deciding on the treatment, and who judges the effects? Who is the patient? Are the effects unanticipated? Or are they foreseen but unavoidable? Or perhaps In the spirit of Professor Elster's skeptical parsing, we should also ask if the doctor in fact foresees those adverse effects, but they are in the doctor's interest, though not, of course, in the patient's. If by the treatment we mean the set of transitional policies, the patient is then the polity, and the implied doctor, those political actors who determine transition policies. But each of these is unavoidably more complex than the metaphor implies. Neither the treatment, the patient, nor the doctor is a unitary actor. Indeed, not only are they complex social entities, they are the result of highly contested political processes, as evident in the many examples that Professor Elster gives. In particular, adverse consequences may be adverse for some, while positive for others. Thus, the patient is too unitary, and the doctor is more akin to a group of uncooperative cooks, to take the metaphor from the hospital to the kitchen, forced by circumstances into the same kitchen, but attempting to impose their own recipes and indeed choice of menu than to a single doctor pursuing the best course for a single patient. Thus, Professor Elster's analysis of trade-offs lays out a research agenda inviting a deeper analysis of the politics of transitional processes. Under what conditions does the pursuit of one of the trio of justice, truth, and peace sharply undermine the others? Under what conditions do the iatrogenic effects so undermine the desired effects that a given treatment should be abandoned and a different one pursued? And who makes such judgments in practice, and on what basis? And on what basis should we judge those decisions and their results? Consider, for example, polities where rebels and their supporters have fought for broader distribution of both economic resources and political power. In such oligarchic societies, a transition to peace may take the form of a democratic political bargain, whereby insurgents compromise on their demands for economic goods, but secure political participation, and elites compromise their hold on political power, but retain economic prerogatives. In both South Africa and El Salvador, remarkably successful transitions to both peace and democracy took this form, to the surprise of many commentators at the time. Note that democratization was an instance of alleviative justice, and one that also promised future, though limited, distributive measures through democratic politics. And indeed that came to pass, though much more so in El Salvador than South Africa today. Now, in these transitions, there were clear losers, but three conditions undermined their capacity to derail the process. First, because the processes of war had transformed the polity's political economy, economic elites whose core interests had been reconstituted during the war pushed for a negotiated settlement in both cases, despite their long history of recalcitrance. The losers, Afrikaner sectors dependent on control of the state, and Salvadoran agrarian elites who had not diversified their interests, were expendable. Second, over the course of the war, the insurgents, through ongoing mobilization, had constituted themselves as essential actors for war to end. And third, not only would they negotiate a settlement, but they could deliver their constituents. In both polities, then, justice as punishment and reparations took second place to truth-telling and peace-building, while apartheid practices were exposed to such an extent that the fundamental injustice of the regime could no longer be denied, as Professor Elster argues. Individual perpetrators, with rare exceptions, were not prosecuted even when they did not fully acknowledge their actions, nor has reparation or restitution occurred except on a very limited scale. In El Salvador, the sharply asymmetric nature of violence was established by the UN-sponsored Truth Commission, but amnesty, not punishment, for state forces followed, with the exception of the killers of the Jesuit priests. In lieu of judicial accountability, an ad hoc commission compiled a list of the 100 officers with the worst human rights record, and they were subsequently purged from the military and police. But, as Professor Elster argues, such purges are not justice. In some cases, even where this democratizing political pact is not available, wartime transformations of the political economy and the political balance of power may lessen some of the trade-offs laid out by Professor Elster. For example, if transformation has been profound, the likely cause of recurrent conflict may be, and indeed often is, very different from the cause of the original conflict, thereby lessening the need for alleviative justice measures and freeing resources for reparation or distributive justice for the presently needy. But it is likely more often the case that wartime transformations sharpen rather than blunt the trade-offs among our trio. Although land concentration decreased over the course of the Salvadoran conflict, for example, in Colombia it has significantly increased, thereby sharpening the trade-off between restitution and distributive justice. The above, I think, suggests that scholars pursuing the research agenda laid out in the lecture should pay careful attention to issues of timing and sequencing, as well as the conditions that sharpen or mitigate the iatrogenic effects. Policies likely to spark renewed conflict today may be much less likely to do so in 2 or 5 or 10 years. And policies may spark conflict if not accompanied by countervailing measures in a particular order. And scholars should be wary of an overly deterministic and pessimistic approach to transitional processes. Although the balance of power at the time of transition shapes initial terms and policies, subsequent events may not unfold as foreseen in positive as well as negative ways. As bargaining continues, as truth commissions do their work, as information emerges, as civil societies recovers or develops autonomy from the state and rebel forces, truth-telling may ultimately be significantly more thoroughgoing than prescribed by transition policies, as the example of leaked list of suspected abusers suggests. And scholars will need to be wary of working with overly aggregate categories. Victims likely have heterogeneous preferences over the trade-offs. For example, in many conflicts, the pattern of abuse by state forces may be sufficiently different from that of rebel forces that victims faced with trade-offs may prefer distinct forms of justice or may prefer justice over truth or truth over justice. Aggregating preferences, even for victims, may be challenging, particularly in light of the fact that perpetrators may also have been victims, as when abusive combatants were recruited as children, or when victims of egregious violence found or joined armed groups. Turning now to some of the claims that I want to question. One of the most thought-provoking arguments of the paper presented today is that concerning the trade-off between justice and peace. Professor Elster finds unpersuasive the argument that justice in the form of prosecution of war criminals in power is important as a deterrent to future war criminals, and argues that the threat of prosecution is much more likely to prolong their stay in power. Yet there are reasons other than deterrence to value prosecution, including the restoration of the rule of law in settings where conflict or authoritarian rule has drastically undermined judicial autonomy. So the cost of failure to prosecute may not be a failure to deter, but the very quality of the restored polity. Moreover, agreements not to prosecute have decreasing capability given the turn to prosecution years or even decades later in several countries after just such agreements, and the emergence of universal jurisdiction for just the type of crimes those in power might face. And even if the war criminal continues in power, the threat of accountability may lessen abuses. If nonetheless prosecution is deemed too costly, the claim that truth without justice may do harm must be evaluated for different kinds of truth. Professor Elster argues that knowing both the identity of the perpetrator and knowing that he will go free may be worse for the victim than not knowing his identity. I'm not entirely persuaded. Even if I knew the perpetrator would go free, knowing who he is gives a direction to my anger that in the absence of that knowledge may be more harmful, either in its quality, my need to know was not even recognized by the new state, or in direction, towards a more diffuse target or towards a false one. However, even if we grant Professor Elster's argument for this kind of truth, other types of truth seem less amenable to this reasoning. For example, knowing where to find the body or bodies of my disappeared kin is likely very important to me, even if I know the perpetrator goes free. Relatedly, perhaps Professor Elster's requirement that civil peace be free of strong emotions such as hate is too strong a requirement. Perhaps in the aftermath of violent conflict, that is too much to ask. Rather, perhaps by civil peace, we should mean the absence of the social or political expression of violent emotion. Finally, I'd like to emphasize that the iatrogenic effects in Colombia reflect in part the implementation of transitional justice measures in a distinctly non-transitional context. Although the paramilitaries demobilized, in part, the guerrilla forces have not. As a result, with war ongoing, fewer state resources are available for justice measures of any kind, and truth-telling has been undermined in Colombia by the failure to incorporate all actors into various processes, from the confessions by just paramilitaries to participation in historical memory processes. That the so-called confessions are confidential, with only formally certified victims allowed to attend, as Professor Elster points out, results in limited punishment without collectively known truth, an aspect deepened by the extradition of paramilitary leaders to the United States. And the autonomy of civil society and the judicial branch has been curtailed by deeply undemocratic practices of state surveillance and by government rhetoric, often equating opposition actors with guerrilla organizations. In closing, I'd like to again thank Christian Harpviken for inviting me to comment, and also to express my gratitude to two graduate students, Onur Bakiner and Sarah Daly, for suggestions based on their dissertations on these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby, for very perceptive comments. And I think if any missed during Jon's presentation how deeply troubling and existential many of these issues are, I think you certainly drove it home to us. So there is plenty of room for not only further debate, but as you also pointed out, further research here. The second commentator is Dagfinn Føllesdal. He also speaks Norwegian, but will here speak in English. His primary engagement at the moment is as a Clarence Irving Lewis Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University. He's also a Professor Emeritus at the University of Oslo. He has held positions at Harvard, Berkeley, and again, Collège de France, like Jon Elster, the main speaker. Dagfinn has published and lectured extensively on topics such as the philosophy of language, hermeneutics, and phenomenology, and I'm very glad, Dagfinn, that you accepted to be a commentator. Please.
Yes, I'm very grateful for the invitation to be a commentator to Jon's paper. I always enjoy Jon's work, and I read it with great interest. Jon combines detailed case studies with broad general considerations. The one supports the other. Obviously, explicit or implicit generalizations are supported or refuted on the basis of case studies, so that generalizations that do not fit in with the individual cases have to be given up or at least supplemented in important ways. But it's maybe less often noted that the dependence also works the other way. One cannot even carry out a case study without making assumptions about general features. One's delimitation of the case, the choice of features one elects to focus on, what one mentions and does not mention, it all reflects one's conscious, or not so conscious, conception of how things in general hang together, what is relevant for what, and so on. So general considerations and case studies hence have to go hand in hand. These are kind of minimum requirements. More is needed in order to get good and interesting research. And Jon has all these other things that are needed. His case studies are precise, and the crucial points are brought out very clearly and well documented. We heard from Christian Hartvig that Jon is in charge of this micro foundational study. And I think this is very characteristic of Jon, to go into the micro dimensions and see very carefully exactly how these things hang together, rather than staying on the general level all the time. But what is now the most important, I think, is that Jon often describes his cases in new terms, terms generated by new and interesting general considerations that are of great value in themselves and also contribute to throwing new light on the case studies. An example is Jon's distinction between alleviative and transitional justice, which is central in this discussion of justice in this lecture. Alleviative justice refers to measures that are taken to address and alleviate the injustice that caused the conflict, rather than those that are caused by it, and that we try to deal with through transitional justice. So this distinction helps us to better understand the cases that Jon uses to illustrate his points. Describing the cases in these terms make us attend to features that often might be tended to be overlooked. In terms taken for the general theory, they help us to see features of the cases that make us understand better what is going on. I think that is one of the differences between just trivial work and innovative work. And I think that's one important feature very much of what Jon has been doing. So Jon gives a lot of examples to illustrate this. The Athenian reform of the political system in 411 and 43 BC. Henry IV, granting of the Calvinist minority the right to worship in their own cities, the recent conflict in Sri Lanka, and the process of land reform in Colombia. These are all cases where these distinctions that Jon is making is helping to throw more light on the situation. And if we had more time for this discussion, much more time, I would have liked to make this interplay between the individual and the general my main theme, because this is crucial to the methodology of history and to the social sciences. And in particular, I would have liked to go into the need for what Jon in other works calls the mechanisms. That doesn't mean physical mechanisms, but it means the detailed analysis of cases in terms of psychology, game theory, and so on, which make the general points plausible. Our great economist Leif Johansen, who died far too early, would have been 80 this year if he had lived. He was one of the pioneers, I think, in this work. He was very, very, very aware of the need to go into the detailed mechanism in order to give plausibility to some of the generalizations in economic theory. However, given that we have only a few minutes available, I'm supposed to end in after 15 minutes, I will concentrate on one point that was not brought up by the first commentator, but which was a main topic in Jon's paper, and which actually is the key theme of the abbreviated version of the paper in Aftenposten today. And it's reflected in the last sentence of the talk, and also in the reprint of the talk in the program. He says that official apologies presuppose essentialism, which is both demonstrably false and demonstrably dangerous. I want to focus a little bit on that. No, Jon doesn't define essentialism, but he characterizes it as a tendency to treat members of a group as having a large number of important properties together that are alleged to be characteristic of this group. I think that's a kind of vague definition that probably does justice to what Jon has in mind. And Jon gave a number of examples. And also in my own work, I have opposed essentialism in intellectual life. especially the kind of essentialism that we often find in polemics, where a large group of different positions are grouped together and criticized en bloc without attention to the great differences between the people who are grouped together. Typically one uses a label, for example, positivism, idealism, structuralism, and so on. The label is almost invariably used for negative purposes, polemical purposes. That's very much the role of essentialism, as Jon defined it also. It's very often used in order to incite aggression against those on whom the label is put. It's usually not very well defined, and it is applied to people without documenting that they actually have the view that is criticized, and the label is used widely to attack even people one has read. This is not just in philosophy. In very many intellectual disciplines you find this kind of bad use of label. This makes criticism easy. Far more is written than one has time to read, and it's therefore also comforting to learn that there are lots of things that one has to read that there's no point in reading, they're not worth reading. You can put that label on. And unfortunately there are very many people who like that kind of label polemics, probably mainly because it helps to save on the bad conscience we have at the thought of all the things we haven't read. And what worries me the most about that kind of label polemics is that they close people's mind. You simply don't care to read things because that label has been put on them. Such use of labels, or what Jon calls essentialism, is even more harmful in political life. As Jon points out, it often leads to violence and war. We have a special responsibility as intellectuals to warn against label throwing and its dire consequences. And Jon, in this paper, is carrying out this responsibility. However, my task as a commentator is to come up with some criticism. And now I will focus a little bit on that. And the problem is that the general descriptions we use and the descriptions of the cases we describe all make use of general terms. And the problem is, what are the terms that we make use of? I think that's what is at stake here. Some general terms are just vague and are not really applicable and don't really function well in generalizations. But there are others which we really have to make use of. Any statement of a causal connection, a probability, and so on, has to be made in terms of certain such general features. So that even when we do social science or discuss war and peace, we have to group people into groups. And the problem is, how do we group them? And is the grouping relevant to the purposes at hand? It can be very important to group people as blind and not blind, as being brought up in slums and things like that. That's very, very important for many social issues. So the problem with what you call essentialism is that we there tend to group people according to features that don't seem to fit in too well with the general points that we want to make. And I think that is what creates a little bit of disturbance, in my view at least, at some of the examples that Jon gives about apologies. He says, and I quote, when today's Germans apologize for what their grandparents did before 1945, or when David Cameron apologizes for Bloody Sunday that took place when he was 4 years old, they presuppose that the German or English nation exists as a collective unit over time, and that this unit can be held morally responsible. This is quite dangerous. Now, I welcomed David Cameron's statement, and I don't really regard it as deplorable. So what is it that characterizes the statement and doesn't make it quite fit in with what Jon is warning against? I think that I'll use another example where what differentiates is even more clearly discernible, and then we'll go from there back to these other cases that Jon is worried about. And that I picked as a Catholic. I decided to pick the Pope's statement in 1992, where he deplored the treatment that had been given to Galileo. he said that this was very regrettable, and he also issued a document that pinpointed exactly what the church had been doing wrong in that case. So that's a kind of apology, which we suppose a kind of essentialism. There's this essential church, and we now apologize on behalf of the church. Now, I think that it's legitimate and also important in social context to talk about units that have a kind of duration through time. Very often countries, what they call nations, and certainly the Roman Catholic Church, is a kind of structure which has a duration over time. And if you express allegiance to that group, then you also should feel responsible for complaining about certain bad things that are done by people, or by that group as a group, or by others in that group. So that I think this is what happened. I was happy that the Pope decided to bring out that weakness of the church, that error of the church. And Pope John Paul II didn't just point out that error. But since he was elected in 1978 as a pope, he spent really his whole long papacy bringing out one item after the other where he felt that the church had done something wrong, and he apologized on behalf of the church. For example, the Crusades, he thought were very bad, and they should never have happened. And he then was sorry on behalf of the church. And here we have to be careful with our terminology. It's not that he meant that he had sinned because of this thing. He had not participated in it. But the organization which he was the head of, and which lots of us had allegiance to, was one which had committed these things. And we cannot really keep the allegiance without regretting that this institution has done these things. And I think this also happened with David Cameron. You cannot really feel that you should be British properly unless you feel sad about those things that happened. But now, according to the Catholic doctrine of the confession, a confession isn't really quite sincere unless it fulfills three criteria. One is that you should feel sad about what happened, but that's only one of them. The second criterion is that you should decide that you're not letting this happen again. The Pope in the statement said, never again. So we should try to work on this institution so that it will not repeat that error that it once committed. And the third is that you should do your best in order to repair what went wrong. In the case of Galileo, there's not much we can do to help out Galileo. But there are cases, for example, of the bloody Sunday that Jon mentioned, David Cameron. These people and their children and so on are still alive. Bad things happen, and you might think that in order to be quite sincere, this apology should be accompanied by doing whatever one can in order to repair the damage that had been done. And to take another example that connects with the last point I'm going to make here, let us see what is happening in Palestine recently. The Israeli government is carrying out these things. If we should get a different government in Israel that apologizes for what had happened, it would be very important for us in order to take the apology seriously, that the new government would, of course, do what it could in order to avoid repetition, but also that it should do whatever was possible to repair the damage. So if land has been occupied by settlements and so on, one really has to do what one can in order to repair all that damage. Without those three criteria being fulfilled, I don't think apologies are sincere. But I think, unlike Jon, that apologies are quite appropriate in many, many places. And then, let us then end with the situation with Israel and Palestine. Here we have a case where Jon's point about essentialism is quite important, because there is a tendency in discussions like this, where you are criticizing a group, to use a label that doesn't quite fit all that you should want to include in criticism. And one such label is Jew. Anti-Semitism is a kind of attitude against Jews in general. And there are lots of Jews, some of my very best friends, are very, very sorry for what is happening in Israel and Palestine. They are doing actively something in order to make it less likely and in order to try to repair things. So these people certainly should not be people who we have this negative attitude to. So the label Jew is misused by anti-Semitists to create negative attitudes of aggression against people who are really completely innocent in this thing that happened. A second label that is sometimes used is Israeli. That's a little closer to the right group. There are some problems about living in Israel, in land taken over from Palestine. But very many Israelis whom I know are very, very much disturbed and working very hard to counteract these policies. And I don't think it would be very, very bad to be essentialists and to include these in our criticism and in our aggression against what is happening. What would be a proper label would be to be a member of the Israeli government or be a supporter of the Israeli government. And I think that would be a group where our negative attitudes should very well and justly be focused. So then, I think that Jon's idea of essentialism throws a lot of light on what is happening when we now get a growing anti-Semitism. However, one of the main culprits in this growing anti-Semitism seems to me to be the Israeli government. They seem to have a policy which really is designed to create anti-Semitism, because they are carrying out these acts that we regard as negative, but when they are criticized, then they call the criticism anti-Semitism, hinting thereby that this criticism is directed against all Jews and therefore should be rejected. And of course, by using the label anti-Semitism, or anti-Semit on people who criticize them, they are themselves victims to essentialism, as Jon has warned against. They are creating a kind of artificial group which is not the proper subject for our criticism. So I think that, although I disagree with Jon on some points, I think that the main point about essentialism is very, very important in politics and peace problems in our time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dagfinn. Thank you to both commentators for such wonderful jobs and such unplanned for, in fact, wonderful division of labor as well between the two of you. I said there will be no questions and answers. That's true, but there is one exception to that, and that is that Jon will get to respond. For as short as possible, but for as long as you want, up to some 15 minutes. Please.
Yeah, thanks, really. Thanks, Dagfinn, for these extremely useful, thought-provoking comments, which I wish I could respond to properly. I can't, so I'll have to improvise and focus on some selected questions. Well, first to Libby. I don't think I'm committed to the whole panoply of agents, actors involved in a metaphor of iatrogenic effects. The doctor, the patient, the scholar determines what the effects are, and so on. It had a more limited and modest purpose to, and as I think you point out at the beginning of your talks, whether are these, when we see, do the agents of transitional justice, whether they are governments or international organizations, do they think about the evidence they have for their claims that certain policies will have certain effects, beneficial effects, and second, have they thought deeply about the possibility of additional unintended or negative effects. It's whether their measures could do more harm than good. It wasn't really, but I certainly agree with you that neither doctors nor patients are unitary actors, and there may be competing doctors, there may be competing patients, and in adequate treatment, these complications that obviously have to be taken into account. Yeah. Well, there's one theme in Libby's comments that I perhaps would like to think about a bit more systematically, and that is, the questions of deals and promises and bargains, and when they are and can be expected to be kept, and when they are and perhaps should have been expected to be broken. The South African case is interesting, where, as you said, the ANC made and kept a promise to respect white property. But we also know why that happened. It was because of the Zimbabwe scenario. Without the fear of capital flight, I don't think for a second that any promise reached in the negotiations between the ANC and the government to respect white property would have been respected. So that's a very special, a very interesting but special situation. Now, as in my talk I gave one example from Colombia in which promise was not kept in the sense that the government couldn't deliver. You said, Libby, that the ANC delivered. Well, it wasn't so much that the ANC, it was this peculiar situation where they were constrained by the risk of capital flight. That made it possible for them actually to keep their promise. Now, in Eastern Europe and in Latin America, several times, transitions either have not taken place or been distorted in various ways because governments, incoming leaders made promises to outgoing leaders that were later overturned by either courts or by legislators. And this is, I think, a very difficult problem in transition to democracy. Democracies are characterized almost by definition by a very high degree of uncertainty. If you knew ahead of time the outcome of a legal process, it wouldn't be a legal process. If you knew ahead of time the outcome of elections, with certainty, it wouldn't be an election. There's always uncertainty in these processes, which makes it very hard for leaders to promise, to deliver on behalf of other institutions in a post-transitional society. And I think the fact that the ANC was able to do so was more, as I said, sort of accident due to the Zimbabwe scenario. Yeah, I was intrigued by your remark, which is probably true, but I would like to have an example that in some cases the likely cause of recurrent conflict may be, indeed often is, very different from the cause of the original conflict. I'm sure that is true, but I couldn't off the top of my head recall an example, so we can talk about that afterwards. But but I think somebody, maybe Christian, mentioned, I can't remember, mentioned Sri Lanka. Problem in Sri Lanka, I think, is really sad because there is no transitional justice and there's no alleviatory justice either. So it's no particular reason to believe that that conflict is over. Yes, and I also liked the other example you gave of how deals you may have. You may strike a deal. Yes, you'll have a truth commission, but no perpetrator shall be named, and then the deal may sort of dissolve as a result of leaks. What happened in these 3 Latin American countries, and maybe also to some extent, I don't know for sure, in Eastern Europe. There probably was some kind of deal, tacit deal, between the Solidarity in Poland and the parallel organizations in Hungary on the one hand, and the communist governments on the other, that there will be a relatively low level of post-transitional prosecutions. And that tacit deal was then, in a way, undermined by these leaks, these internet postings. So that I think in general, as part of the research agenda for transitional justice, I think a more sustained focus on credible deals, credible promises could be very useful, since I just mentioned, I think, half a dozen examples of promises that are not to be credible for various reasons. So Libby objects to my objection to the deterrence argument for civil prosecution, that there are other arguments for civil prosecution, namely the need to respect the rule of law in a post-transitional society. If, presumably, the argument goes, wrongdoers are not punished, then, generally speaking, there will be a lower level of respect for the cost of failure will be in the very quality of the restored policy. Well, in 1945, de Gaulle had to choose a prosecutor and a president for the High Court that was to judge high crimes of treason and collaboration with the Germans. And he deliberately chose people who had been strongly involved with Vichy, because he knew that they would be lenient. Because he also thought that severe punishment on a large scale would not only make reconstruction difficult in France, but also tear the society apart. So if you think of the impact of punishment on civic peace after transition, it's not so obvious that it will be a positive one. Each case will be different. I don't think there's anything we can say in general. But what de Gaulle did was, of course, to carry out some punishments and perhaps not just enough. Well, in his case, of course, well, I won't go into that. But it's now, a very, very important remark has to do with what we might call delayed transitional justice, the importance of processes of especially retribution that take place decades after the original acts. We have seen this in several Latin American countries. I wouldn't be surprised, I hope it won't happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if something like that also happened in South Africa, which could destabilize the country very seriously. So Libby's point is that even if you strike a deal in a transition to give immunity or amnesty or limited punishment, that deal might be undone 20 years later as a result of resentment of the victims. And that is indeed what is now happening in several Latin American countries. So that but of course there's okay. So even if you promise a dictator that he won't be punished immediately after transition, he might be punished 20 years later. That's true. Well, he can also, then he can go somewhere else, which has also been one of the solutions advocated as an alternative to punishment, exile. If you can find a third country willing to take the person. Well, I think I have to need to go. No, yes, I didn't know that the Colombian process was closed, that it wasn't part of the public. That came as a big surprise to me, and that's very unfortunate, because that means that these wrongdoings are not in the public domain. They are kept, as I said, in camera, which is very unfortunate. And I assume that was part of the deal, that it had to be done in that way. That was. Now, to Dagfinn, well, there's no point in Dagfinn praising me, and there's no point in me commenting on his praise, so I'll skip directly to the criticism. Well, let me just begin by the end, because I think there was a misunderstanding. When I talk about anti-Semitism, I talk about visual anti-Semitism of the kind you found in the Spanish Inquisition and in the Nazi regime, where you really believe that a person was either evil or inferior or both on the basis of his or her origins and genes. And they could do nothing to redeem themselves. For instance, Hitler initially went along with Hindenburg when he proposed an exception to the Nuremberg laws for Jews that served in the First World War, because they had in some sense redeemed themselves. But then later he gave up that. So Jews are Jews forever. Converts are intrinsically suspect. It's in their blood. So when you refer to anti-Semitism towards the end of your talk, Dagfinn, you had in mind something very different, I think. You had in mind something of a knee-jerk criticism, perhaps by some people in Western Europe and America, of the Jews in Israel who are carrying out these not exactly atrocities, but day-to-day humiliations of Palestinians and making their lives unlivable. I agree with everything you said there, but it's not the kind of thing I had in mind. What I had in mind is what Serbs feels towards Kosovars, and Kosovars towards Serbs. That goes back centuries, and which is that these people cannot be reformed. They have to be eliminated because they are intrinsically bad. It's a special mindset which is not quite the kind of anti-Semitism you were referring to, which is one I also well know, which I think find as obnoxious and harmful as you do, but it's a different animal. Now, why does the Catholic Church deplore other things? There are plenty of stuff out there to be deplored. Frankly, both in the present and in the past. Perhaps I'm just missing something here. I just don't see the church didn't do it. Individual members of the Catholic Church did all these, committed all these atrocities. And I tried to write down exactly what he said. If you feel allegiance to a group, you are happy when its faults are pointed out, something like that. Or that's not. But it's part of feeling allegiance. Does it cut both ways? Should it take pride in what the church did in the past? Probably. Should we as we as Norwegians feel pride for what people Norwegians living at the times of the Crusades did. If you can feel guilty about things that happened at the time of the Crusades, you should be able to feel pride too, proud about what members of the community did at the times of the Crusades. For me, this is frankly, it's. Well, my main claim is different though. My main claim is not so much that essentialism is false or meaningless, but it's dangerous. It is that to indulge in this habit of apologizing for, deploring what members of your group, I'm not talking for a moment about institutions like the church, but your ethnic or national group did in the past, is to reinforce the plausibility of essentialism. The plausibility of the belief that entities like ethnic groups or nations have an enduring, collective, unchanging identity over time, and that blame can be allocated and punishment meted out on the basis of group membership independently of individual actions, and even in the face of actions that go in a different direction. I'm simply saying that, well, it's a causal claim. Making apologies has the effect of reinforcing the essentialist mindset, which is very natural to people. It's extremely natural. And let me end this, since it's on a personal note. It's no secret in a small country who's been divorced. I was in a divorce process, and we talked to a psychologist, and he's told us, my wife and me, you have to stop saying you are bad. You have to start saying you did a bad thing. Changing from character to actions, it makes a whole difference. If you can concentrate on actions, then bad actions can be undone. You can repair, as you said. But a bad character, that's unredeemable. It's hopeless. So, well, I did divorce, so. But it's so many contexts where we tend to impute causal responsibility and moral responsibility to unfixed character, where perhaps it's just a situation that's responsible, or perhaps a weak moment. Somebody did something in a moment of weakness, rather than as a reflection of profound, unchanging, bad character. So that's what I was arguing against. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jon, and thank you very much again to Libby and Dagfinn as well. I think the impact of what you just did is going to be ambiguous for us, because on the one hand, of course, you all performed so well, and you all were so extremely intellectually stimulating that this is something that we all will ponder about for quite a while, and that I'm sure will inspire future research and actually ask new questions to an agenda that is already very broad and has a number of practitioners and researchers attached to it, but nonetheless that you have expanded considerably through this event. So that's exactly what we hoped for. The trouble, of course, is that we also need to ask somebody, bestow somebody with the honor to stand here next year and give the PRIO annual peace address. And you put the bar very high, but we can live with that cost. So thank you very much. We'll soon be moving on, but before we move on, just a few things. First of all, Jon, could you come forward? We last year, on the occasion of the PRIO 50th anniversary, produced a print, the PRIO 50th anniversary print, as it were. This was given to our founders. We have some in the basement. We have picked one out now for this occasion, which we want you to have, Jon. You can choose whether you want to have it framed or rolled. Depends on what destination you want to bring it to. This print is it's it's produced by the artist is called Jon Elster. He is in fact also one of those who have worked on PRIO's new visual line, new logo. This was something we did last year. It has something to do with peace and war. I'm sure as you get closer you can see more of that.
So what can we turn into influencer?
You can turn it into whatever you want. Anyhow.
Thank you.
We also have some small gifts for the commentators. Could you please come? This is in fact not from the basement. We don't have a champagne basement at PRIO, but we have bought very nice champagne for you. So please. Thank you. Thank you for the work. Thank you all three, and then you also had flowers from my dear Deputy Director, Elisabeth. A few practical messages before we move on. There will now be further socializing. Once you get into the courtyard, you may pick up a glass. We have been going back and forth, and I don't know how many times we've been going back and forth on whether we should be inside or outside. It's now the latest message is outside. I'm glad about that, because many of us haven't been enough outside this summer in Norway. Those of you who have things in the wardrobe, you can keep your things there. You'll certainly be let back in to pick them up. There will be drinks served, as I said. There will be light food. There will be more music by the same band. We will have a talk by Arvid Hallén, Director General of the Research Council of Norway. A shorter talk, but nonetheless a talk, and something we look forward to. And of course, importantly, an occasion to talk to friends and colleagues, to make new acquaintances, to discuss transitional justice, and issues of war and peace in general. You'll find a number of PRIO staff members represented here, and you're more than welcome, of course, to engage them, to find out more about what PRIO is, what PRIO does, and where it is that PRIO aims. So please, the event here is over. We're now moving into the courtyard. I really hope that you will all stay with us for another hour or two. We're not closing the gates until around about 7 o'clock. So please, enjoy. Thank you.